Good afternoon and a very warm welcome once again. It's a bit of a daunting task and a challenge to have Mr. Singh sit here. He's in the arc of his history in public service, well over 5 decades, seen it all, from a collector to the 15th Finance Commission and many numerous responsibilities where he has contributed to policy making in multiple diverse areas. I remember one of my first ever events, or the first time that I was in the Prime Minister's residence, and it was a cold December evening way back in 1999. And at that time, the government was grappling with a new policy for telecom. The first few licenses had been issued out, but they hadn't panned out as planned. And the first thing that Mr. Singh did was to make sure that all the assembled journalists who were shivering out there got a good cup of tea. So, Mr. Singh, thank you very much for that. I wanted the opportunity to talk about mundane matters. But the biggest matter at this point of time, $30 trillion in GDP as an ambition, a growth rate that will have to be above 7%, up till 10% to deliver that kind of growth, and a per capita income which lifts us from our current $2,400 to at least 5 times to be a middle income economy. And for all of this, the mighty Sarkar, Bharat Sarkar, and its role is increasingly coming into focus. We started off by talking about how a lot of things that we see in our daily life seem to be impacting us. I want to begin by asking you, is it time to downsize Bharat Sarkar, or should we go the other way, sir?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Siddharth, for this privilege of inviting me to the inaugural session on the daunting challenges which lie ahead in how to make India a developed economy by 2047. I'm indeed, it's my privilege to be here at this session. The session is captioned, Ab ki baar Sarkar. Ab ki baar, if I were to rephrase the title, I would say, Ab ki baar bhi Sarkar mein parivartan. Kyunki, very frankly speaking, to imagine that nothing much has happened in the last 10 years or 15 years would be an oversimplification. Lots has happened. Lots has yet to happen. So I think that you must recall that in the last 10, 12 years, very closely, government as an entity has evolved in fundamental ways. Couple of examples. I do not remember, Siddharth, any other time in post-independence India where there was such symmetry between fiscal and monetary policies, where economic growth was coming at the back of a stable macroeconomic framework. I think of no other instance. I think of no other instance when privatization was being embraced with such alacrity, in an ability to get out of a mindset of Fabian socialism, which unfortunately we inherited during our independence struggle. That Fabian mindset, or Fabian socialist mindset, is a difficult challenge, and it requires fundamental changes at different layers of government, at different layers of administration. Has it happened? Well, there are some very important changes. Technology has been a major guiding factor. Recall, Siddharth, of the days you mentioned something. Recall of a slightly earlier period in which it was often joked that out of the X amount of rupees or X percentage of rupees that the government wants to send to the rural economy, for public distribution system and others, only an infinitesimal fraction reaches. The use of digital economy has changed all that. In the pandemic, you would have seen the changes in the public distribution system, the manner in administration of subsidies, the manner in which the governance matrix has changed by increasing reliance on technology. Here's a fundamental change. Here's quite a mindset change too. Is that adequate as we move forward? Perhaps not. There are more far-reaching changes which are necessary, and we can come to that as we proceed in this interview.
When reforms started, it was easy for very senior people in the government to conceive them and implement them because a lot had to do with the framework of rules. But today, the question that is really being asked is, what are the changes and reforms that are needed to the steel frame of the bureaucracy? You spoke about technology. Before technology came, the same bureaucrats, the same policymakers were not able to deliver public goods efficiently. Technology has made a change. Aadhaar has made a change. So what are the reforms, Mr. Singh, in your vast experience that you feel are needed to really make the bureaucracy relevant in India in 2047?
Thank you. I think that, as I mentioned to you per se in my earlier comments, Siddharth, changes only at the central level is inadequate. You need to have changes that you began. We need to have changes at the way in which local self-government, for instance, functions. Because that's the first contact. Would you be surprised that when I was examining on a response to the pandemic, I was shocked to discover that the primary health centers in India, to give you an example, had no lab facilities. There was no facility of having important blood checks. This is primary health center. We did give vast amounts of money, but that was just an example. Has, for instance, the relevant changes following the constitutional amendment on delegation of powers to panchayats, to local self-governments, been executed? No. Because the three important things of power, functionaries and finance, which was intended in the constitutional amendments, have not happened. So the changes will have to take place at that cutting edge, which is the cutting edge where average common man comes in contact. He comes in contact with panchayats, he comes in contact with the municipalities, he comes in contact with his primary health centers, with his primary school. That is an area where much more fundamentally changes need to take place. Then, of course, you come to the state government at the next level. State governments are an uneven picture. They're an uneven picture in terms of their financial vision, in terms of their ability to attract private capital. One of the big stories, Siddharth, which you will see, is that money alone is not the answer. In spite of money, some of the endemic states, the divergences between the more advanced stage and the states which have lagged behind has continued to grow. And that's a major issue. It's a political challenge too. And of course, you come to central government. I don't want to get into that, but look, for instance, a very minor change. I would say it's a minor, but not an unimportant change. The current controversy on being able to induct people laterally has led to a huge political storm. Even though I'm a member of a recognized service, I think that it has often been a question, how do you invigorate this service? By attracting the best possible talent which is available across. This is the modest way in which this government has begun by way of lateral entrance, in a non-discriminatory way, in a manner where the productivity gains across the system would be very, very significant. We need to therefore question that, have we reached a point when the rationale and necessity of a permanent civil service needs to be put on the drawing board, and how, while ensuring that continuity goes forward, stability is not jeopardized, you bring about changes in the permanent civil service establishment by opening it up to innovation, adoption of methods and systems which would be technologically more friendly.
Mr. Singh, the lateral entry point is just a very small percentage of the permanent civil service, like you put it. You said time to put that whole concept on the drawing board. What changes would you think are necessary to consider at this point of time to the permanent civil service, as you call it?
Well, there are lots of changes. Siddharth, you are aware of this. I was surprised that the first committee on administrative reforms was set up even before we became a republic. If you look at the first few pages of the report, of the Gopalaswamy Anger report, that gave a report in 1949 on some of the changes and some of the safeguards which you need to have. It was followed by a successive administrative reforms committee. We recall many of them. There was one that was led, the first one by the former Prime Minister, Morarji Desai, in 1966. You had many other committees which have gone into what kind of changes. Some changes have taken place. Whether they are adequate or not is historically must be judged in the context of the challenges of the state have changed. What is the responsibility for permanent civil service? Why should we have a permanent civil service? It's not an end in itself. The end must be improving the life quality of people, pushing India into a growth trajectory which you rightly pointed out, must be well above 7% to realize the quest of a developed India by the time when we get our first 100 years of independence. These changes will have to take place, as I said in my earlier comments, at multiple levels. What should be the changes which are needed at this level of the central government? You must begin by the recruitment policies itself. There's a committee on recruitment, which was set up quite some time ago, which made some important, robust recommendations that would the recruitment process recognize the fact that the pedagogy today must be done in a manner and educational skills which are in consonance with the kind of far-reaching technological changes which take place. A few days ago, I was in a conversation with the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, and this issue came up that India is adopting technology at a speed which is very, very commendable, particularly artificial intelligence. But what about jobs, gainful employment opportunities? Is our pedagogy and education system in consonance with being able to create high-quality jobs, along with being able to continue reforms which will enable us to grow at 7% plus in the medium term? And these are changes which must begin in the educational system, then in the recruitment process, then the manner in which jobs and responsibilities are assigned at the district level, at the state level, and of course being able to, at the central level. Now, there was a virtue once upon a time, Siddharth, that you preferred dilettantes instead of experts. You preferred people who had multiple skills than only domain experts. We need to shift that focus a bit in being able to combine the virtues of meritocracy, the virtues of domain understanding and knowledge, along with managerial capabilities, to being able to administer a complex country like this, which has challenges of multiple forms of different state governments, which can combine, in the end, much higher levels of productivity of the state. Let me give you an example. People feel that we are one too many in government. But do you know that our per capita expenditure as part of the GDP in the permanent civil service establishment does not compare too favorably with the peer group countries? The total number of policemen which you take, just give you an example of total number of policemen, having 156 policemen for 1 lakh people, way below international standards. Total number of doctors, if you include the Ayush doctors, 1 doctor for 1,000 people. 1 nurse, paramedic for 1,458 people. This is the understaffing. But more than increasing the numbers, it has to be more purposive staffing in a multiple way.
Do these numbers need to be added within the government framework, or should it happen in the private sector? The best healthcare is now delivered by private hands. The best airlines in India are run by private hands. The examples are multiple. You can go down to education as well. Do you still need to ramp up the government, or does the big government have to be reduced?
You need to do both. Because leaving this entirely to market forces, there's innumerable literature which is available that the market forces also require a degree in which you moderate the free play of market forces. Relying on market forces totally would not deliver the most optimum outcomes. The private forces must also feel that there is a public sector. And there are certain responsibilities with the public sector. For instance, security, which I mentioned, policing, jails, the reform of the judicial system. All that cannot be outsourced to private sources. But you need to make them more purposive. For instance, I was amazed to know, Siddharth, that today, in terms of crime, if you used AI in a more imaginative way, at least for some of the states where the crime record is not particularly laudable, we do not even know the time of the crime, an area in which artificial intelligence and technology can buttress with the existing public sector to deliver much better outcomes. So I would really plead for a more purposive collaboration and partnership between public and private sector in the area of the entire working of the state apparatus.
Mr. Singh, is the Ministry of Steel, because you spoke about central level reforms, are ministries like the Ministry of Steel, the Ministry of Civil Aviation, and the list could go on, relevant in today's day and age? And will they be, more importantly, relevant 2 decades down the line?
Well, civil aviation now, the ministry has folded up, excepting for a necessary regulatory role. Government is not running airlines anymore. A very happy outcome of the way in which market forces have really fine-tuned the government's policy. You mentioned about steel. I agree with you. That's an area where the challenge is different. The challenge today in the steel sector is how do you loosen and how do you moderate the fossil fuel footprint in the manufacture of steel. Government needs to invest into R&D to make sure that the way in which steel technology is evolving, steel technology becomes more environmentally friendly with much lesser fossil fuel footprint. In the entire building and the construction sector as a whole, from steel, there are many other areas where I think that the public sector. But one of the good things which you would have noticed is for the first time, this government, a couple of years ago, made a very important policy statement that except for key strategic areas, there is no need for the public sector to exist. And I think that that's a very important mindset change, moving away from an era of what I call the Fabian socialism into an era which is more contemporary to meet the challenges which lie ahead.
Yet the same government, Mr. Singh, while it spoke about that, continues to pump in a lot of taxpayer money into an entity like Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited. You played a very decisive role way back in 1999 when you were in Prime Minister Vajpayee's office, in the Prime Minister's office, playing a very important role. What is the relevance of Sarkari telecom companies in today's day and age?
I think the Sarkari telecom companies need to be able to survive in today's market competition, and through to being able to provide service at cost which are affordable and dependability which really does not disable India in being able to harness the advantage of this great technological changes. But think of the area. I'll give you another example, Siddharth, which was of a period which you mentioned. At one stage in the Ministry of Finance, I felt that the kind of buildings which are being produced by CPWD, both in India and abroad, was making us not the most shining example of a country on the march. And I had proposed that the CPWD be folded up, and a decision which was about to be taken, but CPWD does exist, because the argument which was given, the areas which are far-flung, like in Northeast, at that time in J&K, and other parts of the country, there would be, considering the risk aversion of the private sector, there would be no entity to be able to undertake the job which the CPWD was given. Equally coming to telecom, that in areas which are far-flung and where security considerations are there, it's important perhaps to have an entity like the MTNL to cater to the special problems and obligations which we have for the development of the country as a whole.
Mr. Singh, since we've been speaking about the steel frame and its contribution, I must also ask you about the role of politics, because our bureaucracy functions under a system where the elected leaders have primacy. Given the pulls and pressures that the bureaucracy faces at various levels, what kind of reforms are required there to ensure that the steel frame actually remains so and doesn't get rusted or come under attack from the political establishment?
Well, I think that there are multiple things which come to my mind. Among the multiple things which come to my mind is that how do you firewall the civil service establishment from a democratic framework which necessitates that periodic elections must be held, and the holding of these periodic elections is part of the responsibility which is very admirably being performed by the steel frame in terms of the quality of elections which we have. We have one too many elections. I thought I'll make that observation. We need to really reduce the time which the nation's energy is going in holding elections on a continuing basis for over the 5-year cycle. We need to restructure that among the reforms. We need, as I said, to alter the responsibilities of the recruitment process itself. And recruitment doesn't only take place by the Union Public Service Commission. Each state government have their own state recruitment entities. We need to alter the manner and processes of that to align them with what today's challenges are and being able to adopt and accept technology. We need to accept the need for innovations like bringing in domain knowledge and domain skills which can enhance the quality and productivity of the civil service establishment as a whole. The number of changes are far-reaching. One final change, which I'll mention. One of the things which has often been debated in this country is the role of the Chief Minister's office versus the Chief Secretary's office. The role of the Prime Minister's office with the necessity of having a cabinet office. And what kind of a harmony the cabinet office, does it have an important responsibility? Or does it really, with the increasing prominence of the Prime Minister's office, has the cabinet office lost its significance? I'll take a minute on this because this is very important in terms of the question, Siddharth, which you asked, which is firewalling. And so you'll be very surprised that when Jawaharlal Nehru became the first Prime Minister of India, the issue arose of what kind of a Prime Minister's office should he have. And Lord Wavell, who presided over some of this, wrote in an incident a letter to say that I have deliberately made sure that Jawaharlal only has his private secretary and will remain in the rank of a private secretary, lest he goes astray and the institution of the cabinet secretary gets nullified. Now, time has evolved, the cabinet office exists, the Prime Minister's office exists. They are both needed. Why? The cabinet office functions is that as a secretary to the Council of Ministers to ensure adherence to rules, to discipline, framework, where the basic features of the establishment are not upset. The Prime Minister's office exists primarily to advise the Prime Minister in the transaction of his function. This is an area where firewalling has worked to India's advantage, equally so in the state government between the Chief Minister's office, and some Chief Ministers have been powerful Chief Ministers, and the Chief Secretary's office. So I think that enough structures are there. We need to make sure that these institutions which are there and the check and balances which exist function with impartiality and alacrity which the Constitution expects them to do.
Given the questions that some people have on institutional independence, how do you think we can ensure that our institutions, important regulators and other entities remain truly independent despite the fact that they will perhaps continue to be piloted by members of the steel frame, especially some of those who retire and then get very important positions?
Well, let me put it this way to you. It's an important question. Who will regulate the regulators? Should there be a super regulator to regulate all regulators? It's a perennial question. The answer begins, I think, Siddharth, in something which I've mentioned up per se. How do you select the regulators? I was the chairman of the committee which selected the first power regulator, to give you an example. And that also gave recommendation that each state government must have their own power regulators. Very frankly speaking, I'm quite happy to be able to confess that that purpose seems to be substantially defeated. Why? Because state power regulators are not independent enough to be able to fix tariffs, which are in consonance with what the tariff fixation should be, are able to bill in a manner which enables straight transmission and distribution, power distribution companies to function with independence. It is embedded in some of the laws which need to be changed, both in the way in which the recruitment of these regulators are done and their ability to perform their functions independently, which their Act expects them to do. And to have a look at the independence of regulators is a very important issue, which I think would be an important change to bring about a better quality in the working of the civil service establishment.
So you know about the RBI, and we have had some experts comment on this as well. In the recent past, we saw two people from the private sector come in to the Reserve Bank. They both left. Telecom regulator, the pharma regulator, the aviation regulator, all of them are retired IAS officers. Why does this continue? Why doesn't that get open to lateral entry or private sector recruitment?
Well, very frankly speaking, let me tell you, we have begun for the first time, we have begun in a non-discriminatory, in a manner where the Union Public Service Commission will be recruiting people at levels of directors and deputy directors of government. Let me ask you a question, that do you believe that the examples where private sector people came to occupy the space of being the governor of the central bank was a fundamental roaring success? I think you would have a mixed opinion on this. And there were only one that I remember. The other one was an insider, if I remember. No need to take names. There was only one. And part of the reason why, I think it was because you do need to have an understanding of the working and intricacies of the system in which you work. After all over the world, if you ask me, the governors are appointed both for their domain knowledge, but also for an understanding that you have to work in a system and in a framework. You are part of the framework. The idea of having a completely independent governor of a central bank or a governor of the Reserve Bank or a Federal Reserve is alien even to the more advanced economies. How many would want to agree that the Fed chief, for instance, is appointed only for his domain understanding, and that the Treasury Secretary in the presidential office has no say? None. How many would believe that the governor of the Bank of England is appointed? How many would believe that the Basel norms are being applied by people who are completely people only with domain experts, without knowing the variations in the development of economies of East European country, of the European central banks? I do believe that whereas the best talent and best domain talent must be selected, you need to have a fair amount of understanding of the working of the system as a whole, of which he remains and must remain an integral part.
Mr. Singh, there's so much more to discuss on this topic. Just one final comment. When I was trying to read up for this session with you, I realized that the United States has possibly the smallest steel frame in the advanced economies. China, which is the second largest economy, has in fact the highest level of lateral entry across sectors. You talk about technology sectors, governance, banking, financial sector. They bring in a lot of people from the private sector. Does India need a middle path between the scenarios that you sketched out and the reality of the future? Final question for the day to you.
I fully agree with you. We need a middle path. That's what we have opted for. That's what the option has been exercised by the government in having lateral entrance. And the debate on that is raging. I'm entirely in favor of the steps which have been taken. I agree with you that just like anything else, India follows the middle path. And in this one too, we are following that middle path.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh, because the topic of reforming Bharat Sarkar is very, very significant. It's also a very vast topic, but thank you very much for taking out the time to get into some of the critical issues. With that, it's a wrap on this session. Thank you very much, sir.